Good morning. I don't know if with this microphone the folks in the lobby will be able to hear me or not. I was trying to shout when I was out there and people weren't hearing me that way either, so I'm glad that there's so much good conversation and connection that's happening, but I want to get this next session started. Our plenary address this morning examines responses of Amish communities to the COVID-19 pandemic. For all of us, I think I can say all of us, COVID has been something that has, in many cases, both pulled neighbors together and also driven wedges between them, offering moments of we're all in this together and contributing to polarization that suggests we have nothing in common. For insights into this wider American experience as it pertains to Amish and other plain communities, we turn to Dr. Rachel Stein, speaking on epidemics and echo chambers, what the pandemic teaches us about beliefs, behaviors, and community. Dr. Stein is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Akron in Ohio. Her research focuses on community building and health in Amish communities, among other areas, and her current work explores how Amish and Mennonite communities are experiencing, or have experienced and are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, how preventive healthcare decisions vary across Amish affiliations, how reproductive choices impact maternal health, and how visiting practices strengthen the Amish community and contribute to its growth. Dr. Stein's work has appeared in publications that include, but are not limited to, Journal of Religion and Health, Journal of Plain Anabaptist Communities, Vaccine, Sociological Focus, Teaching Sociology, and the International Criminal Justice Review, and the Sociology Compass, among others. Welcome, Dr. Stein.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for coming today. Just real quick to start, I feel very small standing up here on this very large stage, just because the stage is very large, and also I feel like I'm standing in some big shoes. When I first started coming to the Amish conference, I got to see some of the folks that I admire the most standing up here talking, and it feels weird being up here talking to you all today. Okay. So as Steve said, today my talk is called Epidemics and Echo Chambers, What the Pandemic Teaches Us About Beliefs, Behaviors, and Community. The World Health Organization estimates between 5 and 15 million deaths worldwide can be attributed to COVID-19 between January 2020 and December 2021. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic to have such a devastating impact on society. If we look back through history, we see many examples of the damaging effects of disease. The outbreak of the Spanish flu, for example, began in 1918, continued for over 2 years, and affected people across the globe. The Center for Disease Control estimates over 500 million people were infected by the virus. That was 1/3 of the world's population. Over 50 million people worldwide died from the flu. More than 650,000 of these deaths were in the United States. The Asian flu pandemic began in 1957, lasted 2 years, and resulted in 1.1 million deaths worldwide. The H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and 2010, perhaps better remembered as the swine flu, resulted in an estimated 500,000 deaths worldwide in the first year of the outbreak. Pandemics and epidemics are not a new phenomenon. Disease is constant. It has always been present in society. What has changed is context, how society reacts to disease. The response to disease changes based on time period, based on location. What disease means to society changes. Medical and public health responses change. The reaction of communities to disease changes. In fact, the reaction of some communities to viral outbreaks has gained the attention of the public throughout history. COVID-19 is the most recent phenomenon to put Amish healthcare decisions into the media spotlight. The recent pandemic, however, is not the only instance where the health behaviors of the Amish community have been subjected to public scrutiny. Today, I will explore how the relationship between health officials and the Amish have changed over time, and how public health directives have been accepted or not in Amish communities during viral outbreaks. My presentation today only tells part of the story. I use newspapers to explore disease outbreaks and the Amish community. Newspaper articles often focus on the public health response to outbreaks and the Amish response according to public health officials. The media, of course, plays a role in painting the Amish a certain way as they promote their news stories. The Amish are often portrayed by the media as extreme. This can either be good or bad, but most often is an inaccurate representation of the community. The differences between the Amish and mainstream society are brought to the forefront when disaster and disease strikes. I will present 4 moments in time as captured by newspapers. Each moment is focused on a viral outbreak that affected the Amish community. The outbreaks have different characteristics in terms of scope and impact. Public health reactions are reflective of the time period. The newspapers capture the public health response to the outbreak and the perception of whether the Amish had been sufficiently compliant to public health directives. In some instances, the media promotes perspectives about the Amish, whether based on public opinion or popular stereotypes. Their portrayals are likely to capture the attention of the readership. I explore how context helps shape responses in each outbreak. After examining newspaper coverage of viral outbreaks, I will talk about my team's research on COVID-19 to further explore how context matters. We use newspapers to understand the impact of the pandemic on the Amish community, but we focus on the budget rather than popular media outlets. Using accounts of Amish scribes, we moved beyond the popular culture view of Amish society to consider how people in the Amish community are talking about and dealing with COVID-19 across different locations. The World Health Organization defines smallpox as an acute contagious disease caused by the variola virus. The virus produces a rash that starts on the face, often on the tongue and in the mouth, and then spreads to the entire body. People who contract smallpox also suffer from symptoms such as high fever, fatigue, and severe back pain. Smallpox is spread through infected respiratory droplets and close contact with people who have the disease. About 30% of people who were infected with smallpox died as a result. Smallpox is believed to have caused millions of deaths in a span of over 3,000 years. As a note, scientists have found smallpox-like rashes on the bodies of Egyptian mummies, suggesting the disease has been around for many, many years. The smallpox vaccine was first developed in 1796 by an English doctor named Edward Jenner. By 1952, smallpox was largely non-existent in the United States, although other countries still experienced outbreaks. The World Health Organization launched several immunization campaigns to eradicate smallpox worldwide. The first efforts in 1959 failed due to inadequate resources. However, the organization regrouped and successfully directed the intensified eradication program in 1967. The World Health Assembly declared the world free of smallpox in May of 1980. While the overall number of smallpox cases in the US has dropped by the early 1940s, outbreaks still happened. At this point in history, vaccination was a regular treatment for smallpox. In fact, when an outbreak happened, the area was quarantined and vaccines were given to people in the quarantined area. Vaccination campaigns were largely successful in stopping the spread of smallpox. We see an example of the public health response to a smallpox outbreaks in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania in 1942. The first news report of the outbreak on December 24th indicated 14 adults had become infected with smallpox. The source of the disease was identified as an Amish woman from Ohio who was in the area for an Amish wedding. It was reported the wedding had 250 guests in attendance. The primary and immediate goal of the medical authorities was to control the outbreak and provide vaccinations for all those who might have been exposed to the virus. In efforts to stop the spread of disease, the roads into the valley were blockaded by the state police. People were not able to enter or leave the community, which included 8,200 residents in a 40-square-mile area. All public gatherings and Christmas church services in the affected area were canceled. The state health department immediately shipped enough vaccines into the area to inoculate 500 to 600 people. Public health officials noted the spread could be limited since the smallpox outbreak was in the Amish community and Amish people had limited contact with the non-Amish. 4 days into the pandemic, or the epidemic, the infection spread to 7 children and 4 more adults, raising the number of infected to 31. All the Amish people who contracted the disease were reported to be unvaccinated adults over the age of 50 or unvaccinated preschool children. The newspaper accounts noted the reluctance of the Amish to seek medical attention was interfering with the efforts of the public health personnel to stop the outbreak. Even so, vaccination efforts were largely successful. The response of the state health department was swift, and reports indicate over 5,000 people were vaccinated within a 48-hour period. The public health messaging emphasized the ability to control smallpox with vaccines. By the end of December, over 6,000 people in the quarantined Pennsylvania Valley were vaccinated. Part of the aggressive response of the health authorities was a fear the outbreak would spread to other communities, as the Amish who attended the wedding were from areas outside of Mifflin County. 2 days after the smallpox case was discovered in Pennsylvania, an Ohio newspaper reported an infected Amish person in the Holmes County settlement. The health department inoculated 800 Amish people in the Holmes County area. An additional 4 cases of smallpox were discovered in Lancaster, PA, a few days later. 2 were Amish people who had attended the wedding. The other 2 cases were not Amish, but were the wife and child of a railroad porter who had allegedly had contact with Amish wedding travelers. These cases were quickly treated and controlled. State health officials in Pennsylvania indicated the Amish farmers in the Pennsylvania Valley were cooperating with the vaccination efforts, but noted they are stoic and don't say very much. The vaccination efforts in Ohio were also successful. The state health director indicated the response of the Amish community has been gratifying. Of all the people who were infected during this outbreak, there were no deaths reported. While the immediate and extreme measures employed by the health officials in Pennsylvania were effective to limit the spread of smallpox, there were economic consequences. Many of the Amish residing in the valley were dairy farmers, with no travel in or out of the community and no way to store large quantities of milk. Farmers were forced to dump thousands of pounds of milk each day. Other industries were affected as well. Belleville housed several large industrial plants, one of which was a foundry and machine shop that was engaged in war work. Due to the quarantine, raw materials ran low while completed products piled up. Factory production was essentially brought to a standstill. In addition to problems with materials, many workers were unable to report to work due to the quarantine restrictions. Even though people were negatively affected by the quarantine measures, everyone complied with the directives. The reactive measures of the public health system impacted not only the Amish community, but the entire valley of residents. People respected the roadblocks in the Pennsylvania Valley. The affected Amish communities received the vaccinations. Workers in the factories in Pennsylvania were amenable to voluntary vaccinations. The country was at war, and the citizens were, in general, supportive of the government and government initiatives. When first introduced in the 1950s, the polio vaccine was widely accepted and welcomed by most in US society. The vaccine provided relief to parents who lived in fear of their children contracting the debilitating disease. Medical advances in the 1960s allowed for the development of vaccines rather quickly, which raised questions about the safety of medicine. Parents questioned the need for vaccines that curbed mild diseases such as the measles and the mumps. The federal government took a more active role in creating vaccine mandates. Mandatory vaccination policies for school-age children were put into effect. Social movements in the 1960s provided an arena for people to question authority, including that of the government and doctors. By the time of the polio outbreak in 1979, US society looked different than it did 20 years prior. Like smallpox, polio has been around for thousands of years, and scientists have traced the disease back to ancient Egypt. Polio virus spreads through droplets from a sneeze or cough or contact with feces of an infected person. Over 70% of people who are infected with the polio virus do not display symptoms. About 25% of infected people have flu-like symptoms: sore throat, fever, nausea, or tiredness. Overall, less than 1% of people experience symptoms that affect the brain or spinal cord, resulting in paralysis that can cause permanent disability. In a small number of cases, poliovirus affects the muscles that allow people to breathe, which can lead to death unless the person receives artificial breathing support. One of the fear-provoking elements of polio is that post-polio syndrome can cause muscle pain or even paralysis 15 to 40 years after the first infection in people who were asymptomatic when first infected with the polio virus. The number of polio infections peaked each year in the summer months. The first expansive polio outbreak happened in 1916 in the US. There were over 27,000 cases reported, with upwards of 6,000 deaths. In 1952, there were a record number of polio cases reported in the US, over 57,000. People who contracted polio were quarantined for 10 to 14 days with limited visitation in the weeks following the acute phase of the infection. Polio largely affected children and was commonly referred to as infantile paralysis. The impact of the disease on children, the confusion on how the disease spread, the mandatory quarantine that separated parents from their sick children, and the lack of a cure made polio a frightening disease. In collaboration with other scientists, Jonas Salk worked to produce the first polio vaccine. The first available vaccines were administered to volunteers, including Dr. Salk, his wife, and his children. In 1954, Dr. Salk and his team did a national study where they enrolled over 1 million children in clinical trials. In 1955, the vaccine was made publicly available. The number of polio cases dropped drastically as people were eager to receive the vaccine. There were almost 30,000 cases of polio in 1955. 2 years after the release of the vaccine, the number of cases dropped to less than 6,000. The polio vaccine is now a part of the routine schedule of childhood vaccinations, and no cases of polio have originated in the United States since 1979. Unlike smallpox, however, polio has not been eradicated worldwide. There have been cases as recently as 1993 where travelers have brought the virus to the US. In these cases, people in the US population who have not been vaccinated are at risk. The introduction of polio into unvaccinated segments of the population spurs an anxiety reflexive of the fears present in the 1950s. In instances of polio, even one case is considered an outbreak. There were 17 confirmed cases of polio reported to the CDC in 1979. 2 of the cases were non-paralytic and occurred in non-Amish people. The other 15 cases were paralytic and occurred in unvaccinated Amish persons. The cases were reported across 4 states in the US and Canada. The first confirmed case of polio was a 22-year-old Amish woman in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, reported in January of 1979. The CDC linked this case to an outbreak the previous year in the Netherlands and Canada. That is, the disease was brought to the US through travel abroad. The public health response to the outbreak was to make vaccines readily available. By May of 1979, 2 more cases of polio were confirmed in another Amish community in Pennsylvania. The state health department focused more energy and resources into their immunization campaign. In June, there were 6 cases of polio confirmed in Pennsylvania and 4 cases in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Ontario. There was a 3-day immunization clinic held in June in Lancaster County. Over 147,000 non-Amish people and over 4,000 Amish people were vaccinated across the 3 days. By August, it was estimated that upwards of 75% of the Amish population had received at least 1 dose of the polio vaccine. The news media was inconsistent in portraying the Amish response to vaccination efforts. Initial reports of the outbreak in Franklin County indicated the bishop refused vaccines on behalf of the Amish community. The additional outbreaks in May produced similar reports, where an Amish bishop was resisting immunizations. However, other reports indicated the results of meetings between health officials and Amish leaders were neutral. That is, while Amish bishops were not necessarily promoting the polio vaccine, they were not opposed either. In fact, some news reports indicated bishops were on board with voluntary vaccination programs. And in some instances, the reports indicate Amish leaders were concerned by news stories portraying Amish as resistant to vaccine efforts. Newspapers report the health officials in Lancaster County not only met with Amish bishops, but organized immunization campaigns by church district. Health officials went door to door to talk to Amish families. The vaccine clinics in the Amish community were held in people's homes in efforts to maintain the privacy of the community and exclude the news media. Even so, the media grasped onto the reluctance of some Amish to receive vaccines. Several news reports focus on religion as the driving factor for vaccination refusal. The reports indicate Amish people believe the disease is sent by God and they should not interfere. Other reports suggest the Amish reaction to the polio outbreak differs from that of the non-Amish, but is indirectly related to religion. More specifically, the Amish do not seem upset nor fearful of the disease. Several news sources propose an alternative explanation for vaccine refusal and indicate that Amish generally tend to be wary of government interventions. Finally, a fraction of the news reports focus on the information available to the Amish community, indicating the accessibility and accuracy of information might be considered. While health officials stress that for every paralytic case of polio, there are likely 50 to 100 asymptomatic people carrying the virus, there is a question of how well this information was actually relayed to the Amish community. One news source provides insight from an Amish man who indicates he found out about the confirmed case of polio near his community from the milk truck driver. Several reports suggest that when Amish people are provided with information about polio and its spread, they are more likely to be open to immunization. Media reports on the vaccination efforts for the polio outbreak look different than the reports on the smallpox outbreak. In 1942, people in the Pennsylvania Valley complied with the public health initiatives, unquestionably, according to the news reports. The news stories in 1979, however, portray an uneven response of the Amish community to immunization. Some reports suggest the Amish resisted vaccination efforts. Others focus on compliance. Some reporters note the efforts of public health officials to educate and inform the Amish about vaccinations and spread of the disease. The degree to which news stories represent reality, the newspapers reflect a change in the Amish response to vaccination efforts from 1942 to 1979. This shift was due in part to changes in society. While vaccines and government intervention were more accepted during the smallpox outbreaks, attitudes about government mandates had shifted by the late 1970s. The Amish, while not immersed in mainstream society, are influenced by the culture in which they live. A decade later, the US was faced with a nationwide measles outbreak. While the measles affected the Amish, the disease was not confined to the Amish population. The measles outbreak started in 1988 and lasted for 3 years. Over 55,000 people got sick, and more than 100 people died because of infection. From 1989 through 1990, almost 70% of the measles cases were concentrated in 4 states: Illinois, Texas, California, and Ohio. The largest outbreaks amongst preschool-aged children happened in cities: Los Angeles, Houston, and Chicago. Outbreaks were common on college campuses, in jails, and in homeless shelters. Many of the people who got the measles either had not been vaccinated or only received 1 measles shot. Public health officials used the outbreak as evidence for the need of a booster shot for the measles virus. Unlike smallpox and polio, which have been traced back to ancient Egypt, the first documentation of the measles was in the 9th century. Measles is characterized by a rash and high fever. It is highly contagious respiratory disease that spreads through coughs and sneezes. Lingering respiratory drops in the air also cause infection, so people who enter a room after an infected person leaves is at risk of contracting the disease. Before the widespread immunization efforts in 1963, the CDC estimates up to 4 million people a year were infected with the measles, with as many as 500 deaths each year resulting from the disease. The measles vaccine was developed in the 1960s by John Enders and Maurice Hillman. The measles was considered a mild disease, and prior to the development of the vaccine, most children contracted the measles before their 15th birthday. The CDC prioritized disease eradication and, as such, implemented an immunization plan in 1978 to eliminate the measles. The steps to accomplish this objective reinforced governmental policies on mandatory childhood vaccinations. While measles was not eliminated, the number of cases was down by 80% in 3 years. In the late 1980s, however, during the upsurge in cases, the CDC recommended a second dose of the measles vaccine as part of the vaccine schedule. While public health officials concentrated on eliminating disease, the public at large perceived government intervention as invasive and questioned the usefulness of requiring the ever-growing number of childhood vaccinations, especially for mild diseases, such as the measles and the mumps. Some parents resisted vaccines. Some chose to selectively vaccinate their children. While some parents wanted to fully vaccinate their children, immunization programs faced federal budget cuts in the 1980s, and not all parents could afford vaccines. It was within this context that the nationwide measles outbreak occurred. The news coverage of the Amish population during the measles outbreak looks different than the newspaper reports in the previous 2 outbreaks. This was due, in part, to the nationwide spread of the measles. The infections were not limited to the Amish communities. The measles cases were most concentrated in densely populated cities. However, the Amish provided a newsworthy focus as they represented a largely unvaccinated segment of the population. The speculation about what might happen when the measles spread amongst the Amish communities varied. These reports channeled the fear and uncertainty of mainstream society. The first reports of measles in the Amish community surfaced in 1988 and focused on Amish in western Pennsylvania. News accounts indicated the disease entered the community through Amish children who rode the school bus with non-Amish children. Reports note that Amish schools closed and Amish children were being vaccinated at the request of public health officials. The health workers note that while Amish people were largely compliant, it was inconvenient to reach members of the population as they had to go door to door. Additionally, tracking the pathways of infection was difficult, as many Amish families did not seek medical care for illness. Similar to reports on other disease outbreaks, the visiting and travel patterns of Amish across settlements were highlighted in news reports. Measles cases in Geauga County were linked to travel to other Amish communities across the Pennsylvania border. An outbreak in Minnesota was attributed to a visitor from Ohio. A person traveling from Wisconsin for a wedding in Missouri was identified as the carrier responsible for introducing measles into that community. The son of the deceased, a man from Michigan, who had contact with most people in attendance at a funeral, was blamed for an outbreak in Indiana. Many news reports during 1989 focused on the what-if aspect of infection. There are fewer news reports of actual outbreaks in Amish communities during this time. While not evident in Ohio or Pennsylvania, Indiana news reports displayed a clear prejudice against the Amish. The headlines of many Indiana newspapers blame the Amish for bringing measles into the community and suggest the Amish are resistant to public health initiatives on vaccination. However, the text of the news articles presents a different story. The articles suggest the majority of Amish in Indiana were indeed following health directives and getting vaccinated. According to health officials, only a few families amongst the hundreds of people in the population had refused vaccines. Health workers also note they were working with leaders in the Amish community to provide information, had successfully offered immunization clinics, and the Amish had voluntarily closed their schools in efforts to curb the spread of measles. As with previous outbreaks, news coverage largely indicates the Amish followed health directives during the measles outbreak. However, instances of vaccine refusal were highlighted. The discord around vaccinations in mainstream society are reflected in news articles about the Amish. The reports also stress how the Amish are different from mainstream society, emphasizing certain beliefs and behaviors within the context of the measles outbreak. The coverage of Amish communities during the outbreak may not seem so far distant, as many of the same sentiments were reflected in news stories during the COVID pandemic. The news stories in COVID times are also reflective of mainstream society. The stance on vaccines is even more divided today than it was in the 1980s. Children's vaccine schedules continued to expand in the 1990s. Parents continued to question the need for all the vaccines. In the late 90s, a link between vaccines and autism was published. While the autism link has since been discredited, the fear of negative reactions to vaccines remains intact. The COVID pandemic served to widen the gap in the vaccine camps and produced a strong political undertone to the medical debates. The spread of COVID-19 started in 2019, reaching pandemic proportions by 2020. By May of 2022, there were over 82 million cases of COVID reported in the US, with at least 1 million COVID-related deaths. The numbers and the impact of the COVID pandemic are even more astounding when we consider the worldwide impact of coronavirus. By mid-May 2022, the World Health Organization reported over 520 million cases of COVID and over 6 million COVID-related deaths. COVID symptoms include fever, cough, sore throat, and a loss of taste or smell. Older adults and people with underlying medical conditions are at a greater risk of serious illness, including the need for hospitalization, the help of a ventilator for breathing, or even death. Vaccines were introduced in the US in December 2020 and became more widely available in the first few months of 2021. As of May 2022, the CDC reports over 257 million vaccines have been distributed in the US, The World Health Organization reports 11 billion doses of the vaccine have been administered worldwide. The COVID surge in the US began in March and resulted in what we might consider by today's standards extreme interventions by the government. In the early stages of the pandemic, the US government issued restrictions on large gatherings and required masking practices in public spaces. While these sorts of government mandates are not a novel form of intervention during disease outbreaks, the rarity of such measures in the recent past caused the public to respond, either in favor or against the protocols. The divided response was often embedded in political terms and provided a rich source of material for the news media. As the Amish are often portrayed as a world apart from mainstream society, it is not surprising the media lens focused on Amish communities during the COVID pandemic. A common theme across the news articles was on Amish resisting vaccines. Like in previous outbreaks, the news media only tells part of the story. And perhaps even more so today, newspapers are less interested in news than promoting a particular viewpoint. The newspaper stories provide a view into Amish communities from the outside looking in. But what happens if we dig a little bit deeper? What if we try to bring a bit more understanding, not only to what is happening in Amish communities, but how context, how society influences the reaction to a disease outbreak more broadly? The ongoing COVID pandemic provides an opportunity to explore further. To understand how COVID might have impacted the Amish community, we should probably start with some basic information about the Amish. Perhaps the most important point is that relationships are the cornerstone of Amish communities. Amish rely on one another for material and social support. At the onset of the pandemic, the Amish, along with everyone else in the US, were faced with government mandates restricting large gatherings and provided with appropriate guidelines for interacting, including social distancing and wearing masks. While everyone reacted in some way to these guidelines, the Amish were at a distinct disadvantage as their core rituals were disrupted. Several Amish churches canceled services early in the pandemic based on advice from local health departments, but returned to church, in-person church, a few weeks later. The groups of Amish who followed the government mandates, even if only for a few weeks, were isolated from other members of their community. While Amish people have been criticized for not following restrictive COVID guidelines, media reports largely fail to consider how community values and practices reflecting those values might be disrupted by government mandates. In addition, we should recognize the reaction of Amish communities to COVID guidelines did not happen in a vacuum, but are influenced, at least in part, by mainstream society. One way to examine how context matters is to look at how people living in different places reacted to government restrictions enacted at the onset of the COVID pandemic. This is what my research team set out to do. We used the Budget newspaper to explore how international scribe entries differed from the US-based scribe. Some of you might be familiar with the Budget. This correspondence newspaper includes regular reports from scribes across more than 600 communities in the US, Canada, and other countries. In March of 2020, many scribes were writing about the impact of COVID on their communities. Many of the international entries in the Budget are submitted by Amish and Mennonite missionaries who are located outside of the US. It is important to note that I'm making a shift here from talking primarily about the Amish to talking primarily about conservative Mennonite missionaries. The Amish and Mennonites are two distinct groups that share some similar values rooted in the Anabaptist tradition. Early Anabaptists emphasized the separation of church and state, indicating the church should be free of government control. The importance of church and following God's law is prominent in all Anabaptist groups today. While following biblical teachings remains a central component, church members try to live their faith through daily actions. The church's organization as a spiritual and social community creates a structure conducive to helping others and strengthens bonds across members. Anabaptists believe people should decide to follow God's law and, as such, adhere to the practice of adult baptism to join the church. In short, the Amish and conservative Mennonites share core beliefs. As such, we might expect that these groups would react similarly to the pandemic. But while US-based scribes were primarily writing about how they were dealing with the restrictions imposed by the government, missionary scribes seemed to not only accept the restrictions, but embrace them. Missionary scribes seemed to accept without question that COVID was a dangerous disease rather than an inconvenience that must be endured. We use the concept of moral worldviews to explore how country context matters in perceptions of the pandemic. Religious moral worldviews help people make sense of their world. To understand how they operate, we might think of worldviews as having 4 layers. At the center is the moral core, which coordinates non-negotiable allegiances imposed by a worldview. The core is the center of the belief system and is shared across all members of the group who share the same worldview. The second layer contains moral values derived from the core. These values are relatively constant across people sharing a worldview. The third level is action and projects, which translates the values into behaviors and attitudes, including economic and political positions. People vary in how their values translate into these behaviors and positions. The fourth and final layer is custom and aesthetics, which includes, for example, protocols of social interaction, practices of worship, and tastes in music. This layer is the most varied as it is farthest from the moral core. We proposed that while Anabaptist missionaries maintain their moral core the same as their US counterparts, the outer layer of their worldviews differ from US-based Anabaptist groups. We suggest the cultural and geographic context of the country help shape the outer layers of the religious worldview and drive behavior. In contrast to Anabaptist groups in the US, missionaries are involved and engaged with the communities in which they reside. As such, communication is not so focused on intra-group interactions, but includes interaction with outsiders as well. Missionary scribes mentioned enjoying learning about different religious and cultural practices and spending time getting to know the members of the communities they serve. Their information networks extend beyond their limited religious communities and open them up to additional information streams and diverse worldviews, including residents' past tragic experiences with other public health crises. In Liberia, for example, the scribe recalls memories of Ebola and the food and water shortages that resulted during this epidemic. The impoverished conditions of the country of residence also contributed to scribes' responses. A scribe in Iraq reports feeling privileged, which suggests the experience they've had has a meaningful impact on them. The COVID restrictions enacted in their countries of residence affected people's ability to work and attend school, and negatively impacted organizations' ability to secure donations. This amplified food, hygiene, financial, and educational disparities in the population. Missionary scribe letters in the budget suggest that the missionaries explicitly and implicitly supported COVID-19 restrictions, even going so far as to self-impose restrictions in some cases. Several missionaries mentioned wearing masks without criticizing the requirement. A scribe in Iraq noted that mask wearing should reduce the virus's spread. Writers in Liberia and Iraq implemented self-imposed quarantines and continued lockdowns on themselves. The scribe in Liberia, for example, notes they were in lockdown for 127 days, remaining in quarantine after the government restrictions had ended. The lack of criticism was also evident regarding strict lockdown procedures. Of note, other countries enacted and enforced lockdown to a much greater degree than was done in the US. For example, in Ukraine, pastors who did not close their churches were faced with fines or prison time for violating the government orders. In West Africa, the missionary scribe notes only vehicles carrying food or medical supplies with a government-issued pass were able to be on the roads. Even with these restrictions in place, the scribe notes that everyone remained in good spirits. These findings suggest that perceptions of the pandemic and government restrictions may not be intrinsic to the moral worldviews of Amish and Mennonites. Instead, particular contexts may trigger some aspects of their moral core and not others that shape the outer layers of their worldviews. For example, even in cases where the missionaries did not clearly support the guidelines, witnessing firsthand the direct negative impact of COVID-19 on the surrounding communities may have triggered the moral core belief of do no harm in a way that has not occurred widely among their U.S. counterparts. What we learn from this analysis is the way Amish and Mennonite groups are responding to COVID-19 is due in part to where they live, the social context. The Amish and Mennonites have a core belief that individual and social responsibility are tightly linked. They believe that they have a moral obligation not to bring harm or injury to anyone. We see evidence of do no harm in past outbreaks. It is also emphasized in the budget entries from international communities. However, within the U.S., where COVID and political climate are tightly linked, the Amish may be more likely to focus attention on other core values related to their faith and the community. In fact, many U.S.-based Amish and Mennonite scribes reaffirmed their faith in God and to some extent recognized the positive aspects of the pandemic in their entries. My research team was interested to see how the Amish engaged in religious coping mechanisms to deal with the disruption to their core rituals and beliefs. Overwhelmingly, we found the emphasis was on belief in God as a coping strategy. We saw many statements such as, God is in control, He is always there, He helps and protects His people, put your trust in God, rely on Him, and you will have peace. These strategies are consistent with the Amish and Mennonite belief system that emphasizes fully trusting God, who is in control. We also found evidence of what we call a collaborative problem-solving approach to religious coping, where one believes that God is a partner to be worked with, who shares the responsibility for solving the problem. We see this in statements such as, trust in God, but do your part too. God is in control, but He expects His people to take care of each other as well. We found evidence of positive reactions to COVID, where scribes note the pandemic was forcing people to slow down and enjoy home and family. Scribes noted that with the restrictions on gatherings, they now had more time for hobbies and gardening. Related, many scribes also wrote about connections to the bigger picture, with statements such as, life goes on, and this too shall pass. Religious coping is clearly used by the Amish and Mennonites to make sense and deal with things out of their control. We see coping as a way people try to find meaning in life's trials. Religious coping amongst the Amish does not embrace government restrictions, but uses religion as a way to deal with them. Consistent with the core values amongst the Amish, the coping language used by the scribes focuses on living well. This emphasis is different from that of mainstream society, which is more likely to prioritize living long. The distinct values highlight how cultural differences might matter in terms of public health initiatives. For example, the strategies employed by the public health officials to curb the pandemic and disease outbreaks more generally match up with the overall goal of living a long life. To accomplish this goal, it is important to be healthy. The public health response to the COVID pandemic was similar to other outbreaks. Vaccinate. Public health officials are responsible for managing healthcare institutions, ensuring that people can get the care they need. By controlling the number and spread of COVID infections through vaccines, medical personnel can deliver adequate care. Disease is constant. We just explored 4 disease outbreaks that happened within the past 8 decades. These are certainly not the only examples throughout history, and if Steve gave me another couple hours, we could probably examine a lot more other outbreaks and the response to these outbreaks. The commonality across each rapidly spreading disease is the response of the public health system: vaccinate. While immunization practices have changed over the decades, the reliance on medicine has been relatively constant. What has changed most markedly is people's response to disease and to vaccination. People's attitude towards science more broadly and government intervention has also changed over the years. With COVID, we got to experience the onset and proliferation of a novel disease. Part of what made COVID so frightening for many people, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, was that there was no cure and no way to treat the disease. The measures taken by the government before the development of the COVID vaccine focused on stopping the spread of the disease in efforts to keep hospitals from being overrun. Interventions by the government to curb outbreaks are not new. In fact, in the case of smallpox in the 1940s, government and local officials set up road blockades to quarantine over 8,000 people in 40 square miles of a Pennsylvania valley to keep the disease from spreading. In a time of war, the country was bound together with a purpose, and people largely accepted the strict government regulations. We saw similar restrictive measures employed by governments in other countries in response to the onset of COVID. The request by US government officials to isolate and limit large group gatherings may seem a little lenient by comparison. The COVID vaccine was being developed as infections spread. This, too, fed the fear surrounding COVID. Not only was a disease running rampant across the world, but the fix, the vaccine, was developed in record time. The spread of the disease and the push to utilize the rapidly developed vaccine was embedded in political rhetoric, in large part by the media. The linkage between medicine and politics helped create a divided society. In some cases, people felt the restrictions provided safety and embraced the limitations. Others pushed back, intent on keeping their individual freedoms and remaining unrestrained from government control. While politics may drive some explanations of vaccine resistance today, social movements, individual rights, and an emphasis on freedoms have long been a part of the historical response to government interventions. Throughout history, disease knows no bounds. Disease doesn't care about religion or beliefs. How we deal with disease changes. Society changes. The medical response changes. Our reaction to the public health system changes. Through these responses, we can learn about communities. We can learn about core values. We can learn how context matters in terms of how people think about a disease, how they respond to public health initiatives, and, in an ideal world, understanding community reactions to epidemics would allow the public health sector to adjust their initiatives to consider group values that drive behaviors. Such consideration can make directives less divisive in an ever-changing and politicized world. Thank you. I am happy to take questions at this time. Lunchtime. So for those of you who maybe couldn't hear, the question is how the Amish response maybe has differed with COVID compared to other outbreaks, such as the measles outbreaks, I should say. We talked about one today, right? But there have been several. And I don't think the answer is an easy one, right? And so for the part of my talk where I talked about the measles outbreak, I was largely focused on the news media. But we know that there's more to the story than that, right? And we know that the news media is only representing a particular viewpoint in how the Amish are responding. And so do things look different? Yes, they do, is the short answer. What is the reason for that? You know, our research team has spent a lot of time sort of thinking about like how society and how context matters. And I mentioned it very briefly in my talk, but we spend a lot of time thinking about like how the political climate of today's society has mattered so much, right? And so much of the medical advice that is coming sort of from up high, right? The CDC guidelines are so enmeshed in the political discourse. And it changes so often too, right? Which is also embedded in sort of this mixed messaging about like, what should we be doing? And now they changed what we should be doing, right? And so it has sort of amplified the mistrust that was already there, right? And so not just the Amish, but sort of everybody doesn't know what to believe or who to believe. And I think within the Amish specifically, it makes it even more difficult, right, if you're trying to talk about things like vaccination, because there's so much information and misinformation, and we don't know what any of this means, sort of coming at us from all directions. And so I do think it's more complicated today, and I think a lot of it is sort of based on the society in which we live and sort of what has happened in the conversation and how the medical conversation has sort of become not really about medicine so much anymore, right, but is really couched in a political discourse as well. I don't know if that directly answers. Okay, thanks.
Well, I received the vaccine. I had COVID. I had fever of 103, 104 for a week and a half. So when the vaccine became available, I got it. But then I also started getting calls. I'm the only person in my community that I know of that got the vaccine. You didn't mention, did you know that there's all these stories going out around the Amish community about the vaccine? I was told that, well, basically I'm on this slippery slope to hell because I took the vaccine. The vaccine has, in the patent number, there's 666, so I've received the mark of the beast now. And let me see, it's made with dead babies, aborted babies, and what was another one? Oh, there's the government and Bill Gates has put a chip in the vaccine, so now they can find out where I am, which I said, if somebody is tracking my movements, they're going to be very bored. This guy hardly ever leaves this one little place, and when he does, he only goes 3 or 4 miles at 10 miles an hour. So, anyhow, but some of my people, they feel they're going to lose their salvation if they take the vaccine. But I don't feel I took the vaccine and the booster because I had it and I don't want to get it again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those comments. My team is working on some other projects where we're looking at that sort of information that is coming into the community, right? And how people are talking about the vaccine and sort of what that means. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that that matters as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So I've got a question. Looking at all these pandemics, one of the things that's really different today compared to, the 40s, the 60s, is social media. So I'm really curious about your thoughts on how social media has amplified things or changed the response to COVID-19, and especially with regards to the Amish, who probably, I suspect, are largely separated from social media. I'm just curious your thoughts on social media. You talked about politics a lot, but they're often intertwined, so just curious what you thought about that.
That's a really interesting question. And so, as we know, social media is such a huge part of how we get information, whether it's wrong or right? But we constantly sort of have information coming at us. So this is sort of a side note. And so I have a Facebook account, and I often, there's this section where it's like suggested friends, right? And it always amazes me. I'm sort of scrolling through, and it's like, these people know other people that you know, right? And there's like pictures of Amish women who show up, right? And so my guess is that they have not yet joined the church, right? But young Amish women who have social media accounts, which always throws me for a little bit of a loop when I see them there, right? But there are groups of Amish who do have sort of that social media influence coming in as well, right? And so I don't want to completely discredit that. But one of the things that we talked about, and I lost sight of Joe. Joe's in the back. One of the things that Joe recently published in JPAC was an article about how information is getting into the communities, right? And one of the things that we talk about is van drivers, right? And like what are van drivers listening to? What's on the radio? What are they talking about when they're in the van, right? And so when we think about how information, not just newspapers, not just news, right, but also coming through on the radio, right? Like how is that information getting in, right? And then thinking about ways that the Amish and the non-Amish interact, right? And what those situations look like. But that article that Joe published, we cite it because we talk about those van drivers.
Rachel, thank you, first of all, for an excellent presentation. The historical overview and the contextual stuff was really very well done. My question is, you have pretty much talked about the Amish. And you know as well as I know, there's a lot of distinctive communities and affiliations. My question is, as you work through the budget, have you tried to bore down more deeply into certain communities? I'm just curious your sense of how unified or similar the Amish response was to what was happening in particular communities. And I think the value of the budget is it would identify various communities where people were writing from.
Yes, so that's a really great question. And so the things that we have done up to this point, we've talked a lot about the distinction between the Amish and the Mennonite groups. And we absolutely recognize like the Amish is not accurate because the Amish are not just one group that have all their characteristics in common, and the Mennonites are certainly not a group who have all of the characteristics in common, right? And there's a lot of distinctions within each of those larger categories. And so that is where we want to go. And that is where we plan to go with the research we're doing on the budget. And we actually want to link some of the budget communities up with some of the directory data to learn more about the communities and what their affiliation is. And then we can start looking at how affiliation might matter. And so we have not done it yet, but that is where we want to go with our research. Yep.
What really happened? We know the Amish went back to meeting together quite quickly. We know that they didn't vaccinate. We know that they claimed they had herd immunity. We know that nobody died of COVID. They might have gotten pneumonia. But what really happened? Did they do better or worse than the society at large?
Good question. You should have come to Mark's. Did you come to Mark's presentation this morning? Where's Mark? And so Mark talked a little bit about that, and we have actually done a little bit of research related to that as well. We looked at excess deaths, and Mark's presentation this morning was also looking at excess deaths in the Amish community. And what was interesting about Mark's presentation this morning is he was also looking at not only 2020 and sort of like the onset of COVID and what happened that first year, but also what happened the following year, right? And so after vaccines came out, and after some people were getting vaccinated, and after lots of people had already been infected with COVID, right? What does it sort of mean in the long term? And if I'm remembering, Mark, correctly from your data, that you still see some spikes in excess death in 2021, right? And so there's maybe something going on with the different strains of COVID, right, that's still impacting people, whether they have been immunized or whether they have been infected, right? But we're still seeing some impacts of COVID through 2021 and suspect that maybe through 2022 as well. In the research that we did, looking just at 2020, we see similar patterns in the deaths of Amish people compared to infection rates in the larger U.S. population, right? And so things kind of ebb and flow together, which of course suggests that the Amish are not immune to COVID, right? And they were experiencing things in similar ways as larger society. Yeah.
So there was no reason to vaccinate. Similar results if you do or you don't. The other question now about anti-vaccination, lockjaw, if you want to avoid lockjaw, you need to get a vaccination. Well, if you're an anti-vaxxer, you probably aren't going to get the vaccination against lockjaw either. It would be an interesting study of how that disease now returns because you don't get vaccinated. Again, the chances of death aren't that high,
Right.
but it's a pretty terrible death.
Right. So I'll give you a teaser into our next research. And I was talking to Katie and some other members of my research team after we listened to Mark present this morning. One of the things that we're working on is we're using the budget to look into 2021, and we're looking to see how excess deaths amongst the Amish, who we assume are largely unvaccinated, compared to deaths in larger U.S. society, right? Looking at like the points when vaccines come out, like are there changes in how death happens in populations that have been vaccinated versus those who have not been vaccinated? And I don't have an answer for you yet, but hopefully I will. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Rachel. You may not see me over here due to my very short stature across the stage, so I'll jump in. Even with heels, it's a little challenging. So impressed with the work, as you know. It's just been really inspiring to see the commitment that you've made with your research team to really capturing that voice of the community members. You know, we've done some similar work in Ohio, a little bit different strategy where we've utilized our branding with our Project Hoffnung Amish and Mennonite Breast Cancer Project and surveying women throughout the entire state of Ohio. So addressing Don's comments as well as some of your future research, we've looked at a very diverse group of Amish and Mennonite communities with a 50% response rate to that survey. A couple comments and a question. We were very surprised at the amount of effort that was given to provide feedback and comments regarding concerns about COVID, and our survey was distributed both pre and post-election time, and we published those results in collaboration with some community members and Joe Donnermeyer. But what really struck us was that while there were often, several sentences and paragraphs written about comments, often with some common misspellings, we were surprised at the accuracy of spellings of certain key words, like herd immunity, blown out of proportion, always completely spelled correctly, while other terms might have been seen more common misspellings. So there was just this common language that that was used to describe the frustration and misinformation, disinformation, frustration. We thought really that our almost 25-year history provided that trust that we could establish, and we'd actually developed a communication tool funded by the National Library of Medicine and supported by local Amish bishops and leaders. But again, we got to a point, and I'm talking to Dr. Keith Wright with WellSpan, we got to a point where the community said, enough. You know, stay in your lane. We appreciate the work you're doing. And I guess my comment to you, or maybe question, was that we've also heard from community members who've gotten vaccinated and still couldn't be that representative and be that voice. We've had, again, members of the community who tried to share that and couldn't be the voice. What comments or observations do you have, maybe in the work that you've done in reviewing the budget, about where we go from here in combating that misinformation? Where can we go to find that communication strategy within society to help promote, you know, accurate information about this disease and other diseases forthcoming?
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to start with, it's I guess, I don't know what the right word is I'm looking for, frustrating to hear that, that the response to sort of your outreach has has not been super successful. And I say that because in the talks that I've given, and even in our papers that we write, I often talk about you and your group and the things that you are doing as one of the ways to get information out, right? Because the sorts of work that you do is so unique, right? That you are you are so connected to the community, right? And if we want to get information into any sort of community that is largely separate from mainstream society, right? We do it through groups like yours. And when that becomes difficult, I don't know what the answer is. And I've had similar sorts of conversations, right, with Olivia about, like, how do you get information into communities? And I really wish I had an answer. And where do we go from here? My answer is I don't know. But I hope that through the work that we do, that we can figure out a way forward, right? And so we certainly are not done with our research, right? And we keep reading the budget, and we want to keep reading to see sort of how attitudes have changed, how conversation about COVID has changed from the onset to now, right? And what that looks like. And our hope is that maybe we find something there that helps us understand. Thank you.
Let's again thank Dr. Stein for the presentation. Fascinating presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much.